Good evening. Today is November 3rd, 2020. Happy Election Day.
Over the past few weeks, millions of Americans have got out the vote and cast their ballots. Tonight, one of the most intense and talked about presidential elections comes to a conclusion.
This evening, we are bringing you live election coverage of federal, state, and local races as the results come in. MT10 News Vote 2020 starts right now.
Live from Studio One on the campus of Middle Tennessee State University, it's MT10's coverage of the 2020 election.
Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jonas Saich.
And I'm Terica Black. Welcome to MT10 News Vote 2020.
As polls across Tennessee close right now, we want to give you a preview of what races we'll be covering. At the top of the hour, we'll have the latest results for the following races. At the federal level, we are covering the presidential race between Republican incumbent President Donald Trump and Democratic former Vice President Joe Biden. For Tennessee, the Senate race between Republican Bill Hagerty and Democrat Marquita Bradshaw. And Tennessee's 4th District House seat, Republican incumbent Scott DesJarlais against Democrat Cris Hale.
And at the state level, we are covering the following races for state legislator. For state Senate, District 14, Shane Reeves versus Chase Clemens. For State House District 34, Tim Rudd versus Mary Vaughn. State House District 37, Charlie Bum versus Mariah Phillips. State House District 48, Brian Terry versus Matt Ferry. State House District 49, Mike Sparks versus Brandon Thomas.
And for all local elections here in Rutherford County, we are covering the City of Eagleville councilman race between Ryan Edwards and Chris Hendricks, the Laverne expired alderman race between the following candidates: Calvin Jones, Steve No, John Skinner, Kathy Tyson, and Dennis Waldron. And for the unexpired alderman race, Gramey Coates is running unopposed. The Smyrna City Council race shouldn't be a surprise, as voters can pick votes for 3 people. Tim Morrell, Raquel Pebbles, and Steve Sullivan are all sure to win those seats. And finally, Rutherford County voters are deciding on a referendum for or against the legal sale of alcoholic beverages for consumption on the premises in Rutherford County.
Stay tuned to see how these results of these races play out. But for now, polls are closing across the state of Tennessee, but that doesn't mean voting is over. Reporter Dave Stripling joins us now, live from the Sportscom Voting Center in Murfreesboro.
Good evening. We are live at Sportscom, and they just now shut the door. And we had a big question about who stops the line, because everyone says if you're still in line when the polls close that you can still vote. Well, as you see here, there's nobody in line because everyone in this county voted early. And apparently that happened across the state. State Coordinator of Elections, Mark Goins, had a news conference this afternoon that said Tennessee has had a really smooth election day. And that means few long lines, which means we'll get the counts faster. So we're going to update you on who won some of these races statewide throughout the newscast here on MT10. Dave Stripling reporting from Murfreesboro Sportscom.
Thank you, Dave. We'll be looking forward to your coverage as the night goes on. Following an intense confirmation process, newly confirmed Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat in on her first case yesterday. The justices listened to cases involving the Freedom of Information and disability benefits for railroad employees. With Justice Barrett's confirmation, there is a 6-3 conservative majority now on the Supreme Court. Some Democrats, like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have called for an increase to the number of justices. Former Vice President Joe Biden said earlier today he is not a fan of court packing. Vice President Biden's statement today invigorates the battle over the future of the Supreme Court. Over the last few weeks, the nation's highest court has been at the forefront of the debate over who should become the next president. With Justice Barrett now confirmed, the questions now turn to what she may do as a justice and how Democrats will react to her confirmation. Joining us now is Dr. Michael Federici, the chair of MTSU's Department of Political Science and International Relations. Dr. Federici, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to start tonight with what we can expect with Amy Coney Barrett now confirmed on to the Supreme Court.
Well, it matters who she's replacing, and because she's replacing Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was on the left wing of the Supreme Court, to have somebody who's on the right wing of the Supreme Court replace her means that that's a lost vote for one side and a gain for the other, and where you might have had 5-4 splits. Now they're probably going to be 6-3.
Okay, and recently the notion has been that Democrats are going to add more justices to the Supreme Court. So could you define and discuss court packing, and both in historical terms and in the context of 2020?
Sure. Well, the reason why court packing is possible is because the Constitution gives the power to the president to nominate members to the federal court, including the Supreme Court, and the power to the Senate to confirm those nominations, which requires a simple majority vote in the Senate. That means then for something like court packing to take place, one political party has to control both the White House and the Senate. So it would only be possible for the Democrats to pack the Supreme Court if Joe Biden becomes the next president and the Democrats win control of the Senate, which they currently do not have. But if they gained both of those things, Article 3 of the Constitution gives the power to the Congress to regulate the size of the federal courts. So there's only one court that's determined by the Supreme Court, by the Constitution, and that is the Supreme Court. All other federal courts are created by Congress. So Congress can create as many federal courts as it wants to and regulate the size of those courts, including the Supreme Court. The first president to pack the Supreme Court and the federal courts was John Adams. He did it after he lost the election in 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, and he added more than 200 new federal justices to the court. Franklin Roosevelt is another president who put together a court packing plan that he never really had to use. He was frustrated that much of his New Deal legislation was being struck down by the court. And so by appointing many new members of the court, he thought that would cease to happen. But it stopped happening because there was a death and a couple retirements on the Supreme Court. He got to basically remake the entire court the normal way, which is simply by replacing members who either pass away or retire from the bench.
Now, say the Democrats take control of the Senate and Joe Biden wins the presidency, and some polls forecast that the Democrats are at least favored to gain control of the Senate. What would the impact be of adding new Supreme Court justices to the court? And is there an ideal number as to how many specific there should be?
Well, I'd say there's two real effects of court packing. One has to do with the operation of the court, and the other one has to do with politics more generally. It has never been a popular thing to pack the Supreme Court, and the reason why is Congress's power to regulate the size of the court and the number of courts is not intended to be used for political reasons. It's intended simply to create the administrative structure for the judicial branch. So using it for a political reason is greatly frowned upon. Even Franklin Roosevelt lost a great deal of support because of his court packing plan. He became less popular as a result of it. Now, if you were successful at packing the courts, like John Adams was, what would we find? We'd find that that political party, so in Adams' case the Federalists, in Biden's case the Democrats, would be able to appoint more justices and control more courts. That is the objective. So when you ask the question, what's the ideal number? The ideal number, if you're trying to gain that political advantage for your party, is to have a majority of the justices on every court. That would be ideal if your objective is a political one. But that can come back to bite you because there can be a political backlash to it in the next election. The courts are not supposed to be political. They are not a political branch. So when the political branches of government, the Congress and the President, play politics with the courts, it normally backfires.
Not supposed to be political, but has heavily become political. So is there an alternative to balancing the court besides adding more justices? And do you think the court should be balanced?
Well, to the first question, is there an alternative? And the answer is yes. And the alternative for the Democrats would be winning the White House and the Senate. Then President Biden would get to appoint dozens and dozens and dozens of new justices to the federal courts. Keep in mind that there are likely lots of democratically liberal inclined justices in the federal courts who didn't want to retire while President Trump was in office and are waiting for the next Democrat to get elected. So there will probably be a fair number of judges on the federal benches who will retire if Biden wins the election, and he'll get to appoint new justices, and some others will retire as well. It's just part of the natural cycle of federal politics that as justices leave the bench, the new president gets to appoint more. So President Trump got to appoint many after 8 years of President Obama filling the courts with more liberal-oriented justices.
Well, we'll see if Joe Biden does in fact win, if he does go through with court packing. Dr. Federici, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
According to the National Partnership for New Americans, newly naturalized American citizens make up 1 in 10 eligible voters. With the increase of immigrant voters, the immigration policies by both candidates could greatly influence this way this emerging voting bloc cast their ballots. Over the course of the campaign, Biden proposed raising the refugee settlement, sealing and make asylum processes fairly and efficiently. Biden wants to reverse Trump's ideologies and decrease the restrictions. On the other hand, Trump has categorized refugees and immigrants as burdens and said he wants to protect America. This is trending to close the U.S. off, making immigration harder. Joining us now to discuss the state of immigration in the United States and what the election could mean for immigrants, Dr. James P. Chaney is an assistant professor here in MTSU's Department of Global Studies and Human Geography. Dr. Chaney, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Good evening. So to begin, I would like to ask you about what is at stake for immigrants and refugees in the 2020 election.
Well, it depends on which group you're talking about. And while in American politics, we like to put voters into simplistic categories such as Black voters, blue-collar voters, LGBTQ voters, most groups, and especially immigrant and refugee groups, are extremely diverse. With that said, voters who are either immigrant, refugees, or related to someone who is an immigrant or refugee, there's a lot at stake in this election. And just to kind of give a recap of what's happened the last 4 years, legal immigration has been cut in half under President Trump. And so, as you mentioned, we can expect more of that if there was to be a second term under the Trump administration. How that's played out and how that's done, it's a multifaceted attack on immigration in different ways. We've had a drop in what we call the H-1B visas, which is for skilled workers. The number of accepted refugees, as you mentioned, has dropped from 110,000 in 2017 to 18,000 for the coming year. The president sets that each fall for the coming year. Naturalization has slowed, and citizenship ceremonies have stopped for many applicants. I think we're backed up to about 100,000 right now, people still waiting for their ceremonies to happen. And part of that is related to COVID, but there's also been kind of a bottlenecking of people trying to apply for citizenship. Likewise, application fees for immigrants that are wanting to become citizens has increased 80% in the last 3 years. For those that are seeking asylum, it's harder to do so now. And historically, the United States has had policies, what we call family reunification opportunities, and the Trump administration wants to cut that in half. And of course, DACA, the deferred action for child arrivals, is also under threat right now. So with all that said, that's just kind of a snapshot of different policies that could be changed, or there's attempts right now to change them. All that's at risk right now. So the majority, many members of different immigrant and refugee groups who are eligible to vote right now are actually leaning towards Biden. And those are some reasons why.
And Dr. Chaney, you mentioned a lot at stake for those voter demographics. What do you think are the most important issues to them specifically, and how do those issues vary by their country of origin?
Well, that's a good question. That's the most important thing, is it does vary by country of origin. This is an extremely diverse group when we talk about immigrant and refugees, so it's really hard to narrow down, to general issues that affect everybody. If you're looking at immigrants or people that are related to immigrants from Latin American or of Latin American heritage, family separation at the border has been a big issue, particularly in California and Texas. And just a general vilification of immigrants over the last 4 years, or at least the filling of that kind of perceived, is a big issue. When we're looking at other groups, speaking of that, this general vilification, overall, Asian Americans moving away from Latinos or people from Latin American are supporting Biden about 54%, while 30%, at least in recent polling, are supporting Trump. And again, it's hard for us just to narrow it down to just one community and get like really deep into why this is happening. But when you do look at Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, the blaming China for the coronavirus has increased, aggression towards Chinese Americans, and that's been an issue. Indian Americans, Trump has actually courted Indian Americans, but they're expected, at least according to the latest polls, to vote for Biden or support Biden about 72%. So it's interesting to see that. But on the flip side of like what are important issues, if we're talking about, for example, Cuban Americans, they generally lean Republican or conservative, and Trump's really tough talk on, or I guess you could say anti-socialism talk and tough talk on Cubans, the Cuban government has helped to bolster support for him, particularly in Dade County, where Miami is located, among the Cuban community. So again, it depends on which group that we're talking about, and the issues vary, depending on which group and from which region, and as also how long people have been in the United States. We're also seeing, I think this is kind of interesting because in 2016, you saw among people that identified as Hispanic, they supported Hillary Clinton. And right now it looks like, generally overall Hispanic Americans or Latinx Americans are supporting Biden. However, the number of people, or that percentage, has actually dropped. So there's some concern right now in the Democratic Party that Biden is going to lose a lot of support from Hispanic men. And that's interesting to see why that's happening. Again, it's kind of hard to narrow down what issue is driving that, because it seems to vary.
So you mentioned that Latin Americans have about 54% for Biden. So my question is, how much sway could the Latin American voters population have on the results of the election?
Well, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. There's 60 million people of Latin American heritage in the United States right now, and a little over half of them are eligible to vote. And we oftentimes call in migration studies the Latin American bloc in the United States, it's looked at as a sleeping giant. It's unaware of its full electoral power. This election will be one where it looks like they'll finally turn out in huge numbers. So to your question, 2/3 of people who identify themselves of Latin American heritage lean Democrat in most cases. And this is important, but it's more important when we talk about the geography of Latin Americans in the US. And it's also important, as you guys mentioned earlier, their background of what descent. Are they Mexican descent, Colombian descent? To give an idea about that, as we know, we use the Electoral College in the process for electing the president. And most Latin Americans in the United States live, well, not most, but the majority of them are in California. And about 50% of those that live in California are eligible to vote. Texas, which is the state with the second largest Latin American population, about half are also eligible to vote as well. Right now in the polls, 57% in Texas of Latin Americans are voting for Biden. So this is where things get tricky, because when you look at Florida, which is a swing state, and about 56% of all people that identify themselves as Latin American are eligible to vote, Cubans, which make up the largest demographic of Latin Americans in Florida, are likely to swing towards Trump. And so that's extremely, extremely important. And so, as I mentioned before, watching what happens in Miami-Dade or Dade County is extremely important. So where it's going to happen and how it's going to play out, it just depends on the state, and it also depends on the nationality of the Latin American population in those states.
Dr. Cheney, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And coming up next at the 8 p.m. hour, MTSU professor Dr. Ben Stickle talks the state of policing in America.
And Dr. Saich Franklin explains how the year's Black Lives Matter protests may influence the election.
Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jonas Saich.
And I'm Terica Black. We'll see you back at 8 p.m. here on MT10 News Vote 2020.